My birth parents abandoned me when I was 8 years old because I had a stutter and loved video games. My father used to say, "You're not a son, you're a malfunction." 21 years later, they came back and tried to sue my adoptive mother and demand millions of dollars. The judge later, "I never thought my name would be chanted by crowds in stadiums around the world, or that my face would end up on billboards. My name is Julien Renault. I'm 29 years old, born in France, but I've been living in Tokyo for the past decade. Even now, with everything I've accomplished, there are still days when I feel like the scared, stuttering kid I used to be. When I was 8 years old, my biological parents, Aland and Mireille, decided they didn't want me anymore. My stutter embarrassed them. My introverted nature annoyed them. They drove me to a boarding school in Rouen, handed over legal custody papers, and vanished from my life like it was the easiest decision in the world. I still remember that day, the way the headmaster tried to smile as he signed the forms, as if that could make it any better. After that, I didn't see them for over 20 years. I thought they were gone forever. I thought I'd finally escaped the feeling of being someone's burden. I was wrong. They showed up again recently, not with apologies or any sign of regret, but with demands. They didn't raise me. They didn't watch me turn my stutter into a measured way of speaking, or see how I turned my quiet into focus. They didn't see me pour everything I had into video games, finding a place where my silence was my strength. But now that I'm a millionaire sports athlete, now that the world knows my name, suddenly they want to rewrite the past. They're telling everyone I was stolen from them, that my success is built on lies. But I remember what really happened. I remember what it felt like to be left behind. What saved me back then was Elise Renault. She was a retired language therapist, an old friend of Mireille's from college. I was still at that cold, echoing boarding school when she started visiting. Unlike the teachers who talked at me like I was a problem to fix, Elise spoke to me like she had all the time in the world. She'd wait for me to get the words out. She never flinched or looked away. Elise didn't have much, but she gave me a home. She gave me patience. She gave me the belief that I wasn't broken, that I could have a life bigger than the small one my biological parents had allowed me. And then there's Sakura, my girlfriend, my best friend. She's a Japanese illustrator I met during a sponsorship campaign. She's the kind of person who can make even the darkest days feel lighter. We were both drawn to the same quiet spaces, the ones where you don't have to talk to be understood. I've never been the most talkative person, but with her, I don't need to be. She says my voice is beautiful, even when it's tangled in hesitations. Now, as Aland and Mireille spread their lies to the world, I find myself fighting old fears. But this time, I'm not that lost little boy. I'm not alone. I'm Julien Renault, and I'm done letting anyone else tell my story. It was a quiet February morning when everything fell apart. I was still in bed, half asleep, when my phone rang. I groggily reached for it and saw Hiro Watanabe's name flashing on the screen. Hiro's been my PR manager for the past few years, a Japanese-American with a calm voice and a habit of smoothing over any media crisis before it became a storm. I answered, still rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "Julien," Hiro said, his voice tighter than usual. "We have a problem." I sat up straighter. "What kind of problem?" He let out a breath. "Your biological parents. They're holding a press conference in Marseille. It's already live on several French news channels." My stomach dropped. "What? Why?" Hiro hesitated. "They're claiming you were illegally taken from them as a child. That Elise brainwashed you and stole you from your rightful home. They're demanding compensation, and they have legal representation." I pressed the phone tighter against my ear. My mind was racing. "There. What? That's a lie, Hiro. You know it's a lie." "I know," he said quickly, "but the problem is, they're saying it in front of cameras. They've turned this into a public story. They're not just trying to reach you, Julien. They're trying to control the narrative." For a moment, I couldn't speak. My mouth felt dry, like every word was stuck in my throat. I thought back to that day they left me at the boarding school, the way they wouldn't even look me in the eye as they signed the papers. And now, after all these years, they were acting like they were the victims? I swallowed hard. "What do we do?" "First, I need you to stay calm," Hiro said. "Don't respond to anyone. Don't post online. Don't talk to journalists if they come looking for a statement. We're already drafting a response." "But Julien, they've been planning this. They've got a lawyer in Paris and a PR team working with them. They're not just talking to the French media, they're pushing it internationally. It's going to spread fast." I felt like I couldn't catch my breath. My hands were shaking. "They're telling everyone I was kidnapped?" Hiro's voice softened. "Yes. They're spinning it as a tragic story, parents separated from their son. It's emotional, and people are eating it up. We need to move quickly to set the record straight. I'm already working with your lawyer in Tokyo." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Okay, I understand." After we hung up, I just sat there for a minute, staring at the phone in my hand. My mind kept flashing back to the feeling of sitting alone in that boarding school, watching the other kids get picked up by their parents on weekends. I had thought I was done with that part of my life. I had thought I was safe. But now, it was like those old wounds had been ripped open in front of the whole world. I took a deep breath and got out of bed. Sakura was in the kitchen, making tea. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes immediately finding mine. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice gentle. I tried to keep my voice steady. "They're saying I was stolen. That Elise brainwashed me. They're demanding money. It's everywhere." Her eyes widened. "Oh my God, Julian." I nodded, feeling the first sting of tears. "They're turning my life into a scandal. They're trying to make me out to be a liar." She reached out and took my hand, squeezing it tight. "They can't rewrite what happened, Julian. We know the truth. Elise knows the truth. And so do your fans, your real supporters." I looked at her, and for a moment, the panic eased just a little. But I knew it wasn't going to be that easy. This wasn't just a family argument anymore. It was a public war. And for the first time, I realized just how far Alan and Mireille would go to get what they wanted. I wasn't just fighting for my story now. I was fighting to keep everything I had built from being destroyed. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, memories from my childhood flooding back like a tide I couldn't stop. I grew up in a small village in Normandy, surrounded by endless green fields and gray skies that always felt heavy with rain. My parents, Alan and Mireille, were the kind of people who cared more about what the neighbors thought than what was actually happening inside our house. To the outside world, we looked like the perfect family, polite, quiet, respectable. But inside those four walls, everything was different. My stutter started when I was about 4. At first, they told themselves it was a phase. But when it didn't go away, they treated it like a stain that needed to be scrubbed out. Mireille would look at me with this tight, forced smile every time I tried to speak, like she was embarrassed to hear my voice. Alan, on the other hand, didn't bother pretending. Again, he'd snap when I stumbled over a word. "Say it again, properly this time." I'd try, my throat tightening, my palms sweating as I forced the words out one syllable at a time. And if I didn't get it right, he'd shake his head, disgust written all over his face. "You sound like a broken voice box," he'd say. "Do you want people to think you're stupid?" I learned early on that it was easier not to speak at all. At family gatherings, I'd sit in the corner, listening to my cousins laugh and talk while I kept my mouth shut. If I tried to join in, Alan would cut me off with a sharp look, like I was embarrassing him just by opening my mouth. Mireille was worse in some ways. She'd smile at the neighbors and tell them I was shy, delicate, like it was some charming quirk. But at home, she treated me like a burden she had to endure. "You need to try harder, Julian," she'd say in a voice that sounded sweet but felt like ice. "People won't wait around for you to find your words." I remember one birthday party when I was 7. I had been practicing singing Happy Birthday in the mirror all week because I wanted to prove to them that I could do it. But when the cake was finally in front of me, I froze. My mind went blank, and the words wouldn't come out. Mireille's smile tightened, and she blew out the candles herself while everyone clapped politely. "You see," Alan said to me later, his voice low and cold, "you ruin even the simplest moments." Those words stuck with me for years. But even back then, there was one person who saw me differently. Elise. Elise was Mireille's old friend from college, and she'd visit every couple of months. She was a language therapist, and she always had this calm, steady way about her, like nothing could shake her. When she came over, she'd sit with me in the garden, asking me gentle questions and waiting patiently for me to answer, no matter how long it took. "You don't have to rush," she'd say, her voice soft. "I have all the time in the world." It was the first time in my life anyone had said that to me. The first time I felt like my words mattered, even if they came out tangled. One summer afternoon, after a particularly bad fight with Alan, he'd called me an embarrassment in front of his friends. I found Elise sitting under the big chestnut tree in our yard. I remember the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves, dappling her hair with gold. I walked over and sat down next to her, and she didn't say a word. She just put her arm around me and let me be silent. A few weeks later, Alan and Mireille dropped me off at the state boarding school in Rouen. They said it was for my own good, that I needed structure and discipline. I knew it was just another way to hide me. They didn't want to deal with the shame of having a son who couldn't speak properly. They didn't even say goodbye. They just handed over the notarized custody surrender forms, and that was it. The headmaster gave me a sad smile as he signed the papers, and I remember thinking, this is it. This is the last time I'll ever see them. For years, I held on to the hope that they'd come back for me, that one day they'd realize they'd made a mistake. But that day never came. All I had was the memory of Elise's quiet voice telling me I wasn't broken. And even when I was surrounded by kids who laughed at my stutter and teachers who treated me like I was invisible, that was enough to keep me going. Now, As I sit here in Tokyo with the world turning upside down again, I think about that little boy in Normandy who was too scared to speak. I think about how much it hurt to be left behind. And I promise myself that no matter what Aland and Mires say now, no matter what lies they tell the world, they will never have that kind of power over me again. They walked away from me once. They don't get to walk back in now. After they left me at the boarding school, everything changed. I stopped waiting for them to come back. I stopped pretending they cared. And when Elise showed up one rainy November afternoon with papers in her hands and a quiet determination in her eyes, I realized I didn't have to wait for them anymore. Elise got legal guardianship first. She told me it wasn't easy. My parents had made sure to disappear completely, so it took months to track down the documents and get the court to agree. But she did it. And when she finally signed the last paper, she looked at me with this gentle smile that said, "I'm here now. You're safe." Life with Elise was nothing like what I'd known before. She lived in a small apartment in Rouen, the kind with squeaky wooden floors and second-hand furniture that had seen better days. But it was warm, it was safe, and for the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere. She worked part-time at a clinic, but she spent almost every evening with me, sitting at the kitchen table and helping me with my speech therapy. She'd tap her pen lightly on the table in time with my breath, reminding me to slow down, to find the rhythm in my own voice. Some nights, we'd practice for hours, me stumbling through sentences while she waited patiently, never once showing frustration. I remember one night, I got so frustrated I threw my notebook across the room. It skidded across the floor and slammed into the wall. I thought she'd yell at me, but she didn't. She just picked it up, placed it back in front of me, and said softly, "Let's try again." We didn't have much money. Elise lived off her retirement savings and a small pension, but she always made sure I had what I needed. One winter, when my shoes had holes in the soles, she gave me her own gloves to wear so my feet wouldn't freeze. Another time, she saved up for months to buy me an old, second-hand gaming laptop. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough to run the strategy games I loved. She saw how much I loved gaming, how it was the one place where my stutter didn't matter. In those games, I could be anyone. I could be quick, decisive, brave. Elise never once made me feel like it was a waste of time. Instead, she'd watch me play, asking questions about the characters and strategies like it was the most important thing in the world. When I was 16, Elise took me on a trip to Osaka. It was the first time I'd ever been on a plane, the first time I'd ever left France. She used the last of her savings to make it happen because she knew how much I wanted to see Japan, the birthplace of so many of the games I loved. It was supposed to be just a vacation, a chance for us to explore the temples and gardens, to eat bowls of ramen in tiny, hidden restaurants. But on our second day there, we stumbled into a regional gaming tournament at a community center near Yamida. I signed up on a whim, not really expecting much. I was just a kid with an old laptop and a love for games. But that day changed everything. I played like I had nothing to lose. My hands moved fast, my mind even faster. The crowd that gathered around the monitors didn't see the shy kid who still stumbled over his words. They saw the way I moved in the game, how I turned every mistake into an advantage. When the final match ended and I was declared the winner, I felt something shift inside me. Like maybe, just maybe, I was good enough. A recruiter from an international esports team was there that day. He watched me play, then pulled me aside afterward. His name was Yudo. He said he'd never seen someone so calm under pressure, someone who could think 10 steps ahead without flinching. He gave me his card and told me to think about it. When I showed the card to Elise later that night, she didn't look surprised. She just smiled and said, "I always knew you were going to find your place, Julian. Now it's time to show them." That trip to Osaka wasn't just a vacation. It was the start of something bigger, the start of a life I'd never let myself imagine. Elise had seen the spark in me long before I did. And in that moment, in a small hotel room in Japan, I finally let myself believe that maybe I wasn't broken after all. Maybe I was just waiting for the right game to play, the right stage to show the world who I really was. When I got back from Osaka, it felt like everything in my life shifted overnight. I spent hours every day practicing, pouring everything I had into the game. I didn't have much, a second-hand laptop that wheezed if I pushed it too hard, a shaky internet connection, but it was enough. Enough to make me feel like I was in control of something. Finally, Elise supported me completely. She didn't always understand the games, but she understood me. She'd sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea while I played, her eyes soft and patient. "You're building something," she said once, "and you're doing it in your own way." My stutter never really went away, but in the game, it didn't matter. Online, no one cared how long it took me to find my words. They cared about how I played, how I could see patterns others missed, how I could stay calm even when the whole match was slipping away. My stutter became part of my brand, part of the story people connected with. Fans loved that I didn't try to hide it. They said it made me real, authentic. I rose through the ranks faster than I ever expected. Local tournaments turned into national ones. I moved to Tokyo permanently when I was 20, joining one of the top teams in the region. I remember stepping into the team's practice room for the first time, rows of sleek computers, posters of past championships on the walls, and a feeling like I'd finally found my tribe. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had to prove I deserved to be there. I just played, and people noticed. My handle, Renard, a little nod to my last name, and the cunning fox in French folktales, started showing up on highlight reels. Commentators would talk about how I didn't panic when the game got tough, how I always seemed to have a plan. They didn't know it was because of years spent learning to breathe through every stumble, every hesitation. That same focus kept me steady when everything was on the line. It was during a gaming convention in Kyoto that I met Sakura. She was there working as an illustrator for one of the sponsors, standing in a booth surrounded by giant, colorful prints of her work. She caught me staring at one of her pieces, a fierce, bright-eyed fox that reminded me of the logo on my jersey. She smiled and said, "You like foxes?" And I stumbled over my answer. But she waited. She didn't rush me or fill the silence. She just stood there, her head tilted like she was listening to a song only she could hear. We talked for hours that day. Well, I talked as much as I could, and she listened, patient and kind. She told me she liked how I looked people in the eye when I spoke, even when the words got stuck. She said it made me seem strong. Our worlds were different, but they overlapped in all the best ways. She understood what it meant to put your soul into your work, to create something that wasn't just for you, but for everyone who needed to see it. The first time I brought Sakura home to meet Elise, it was like watching two pieces of my life fit together. Elise welcomed her with warm tea and soft questions, and Sakura answered with that gentle smile that always made me feel like I could breathe. As my reputation grew, so did the narrative around me. People loved the idea of the imperfect champion, the guy who stuttered but didn't flinch, the quiet player who could outthink anyone in the arena. It felt strange, sometimes, like they were talking about someone else. But then I'd watch replays of my matches, see the calm focus on my face, and realize they were right. That was me. And as my brand grew, so did my sense of purpose. I started speaking publicly, slowly at first, my voice catching on every other word. But I wanted kids who felt like I used to feel, unseen, unheard, to know they weren't alone. I wanted them to see that the thing everyone told them made them weak could be their greatest strength. That's the thing about gaming. It doesn't matter if your voice shakes. All that matters is how you play. I kept playing, and with every match, every tournament, every moment in front of the roaring crowd, I took back a little more of the power my parents had tried to steal from me. This was my life, my voice, my story, and I was just getting started. It was a bright morning in late March when my team and I landed in France. The flight from Tokyo had felt endless, but I didn't have the luxury of being tired. My stomach was in knots the whole way, the hum of the plane engines a constant reminder of what was waiting for me. Chihiro Nakashima, my lawyer, met us at the airport. She was calm and composed as always, her briefcase clutched in one hand. "We'll go straight to the venue," she said softly in Japanese. "It's important to be there before it starts." I just nodded, feeling the weight of it all in my chest. Sakura squeezed my hand, her eyes telling me everything I needed to hear. "I'm here. I'm with you." We arrived at the press conference early. Aland and Mireille were already inside, seated at a long table draped in a white cloth. Microphones were lined up in front of them like a row of silent judges. They looked older than I remembered, but their faces were the same, smug and self-assured, like they'd already won. The room was packed. Journalists from French and international outlets crowded the small space, cameras clicking and flashes popping. I could see the way some of them looked at me when I walked in, curious, maybe even a little hungry for the story. I sat down at the back with Chihiro and Hiro, watching as my biological parents began to speak. Alan took the lead, his voice smooth and practiced. "We are here today," he said in French, "because we have been denied our son for far too long. Julian was taken from us when he was a child. He was manipulated by someone who claimed to care for him. We are simply seeking justice." Mireille nodded along, her eyes wide and damp like she was the picture of a grieving mother. "We never stopped loving him," she said, her voice trembling in a way I knew was an act. "We never wanted to lose him. But Elise Renault, she convinced him we were unfit, that he was better off without us." My jaw clenched so hard I thought my teeth might crack. Chihiro reached out and placed a hand on my arm. grounding me. "Stay calm," she murmured. "We will respond soon." Alan leaned forward, his hands folded neatly. "We have proof," he continued. "Not just our word, but legal documentation. We have engaged a lawyer in Paris who will ensure that Julian's rights and ours are fully respected." The journalists ate it up, their pens scratching furiously. A few even turned to look at me, their eyes sharp with questions. I knew what they were thinking. Is it true? Could this boy really have been stolen? I wanted to stand up and shout the truth. I wanted to tell them everything, how they had treated me like I was nothing, how they had walked away without a second glance. But I stayed in my seat, my hands balled into fists in my lap. I couldn't let them see how much it hurt. When the conference ended, Alan and Mireille stood up, accepting the gentle applause of a few sympathetic journalists. They looked like victors, like they had already rewritten my story and made the world believe it. Chihiro turned to me as the room began to empty. "We need to move quickly," she said in her measured, precise tone. "They're trying to control the narrative. We have to counter it today." Hiro nodded in agreement. "We'll set up a press conference in Tokyo as soon as possible," he said. "We'll show them the real documents, the ones that prove they gave you up willingly." I swallowed hard. "Okay," I said, my voice tight. "Let's do it." As we left the building, the cold Paris air bit at my skin, but I barely felt it. My mind was on the way Alan had looked at me, like I was a prize he was claiming, not a son he had ever cared for. Sakura slipped her hand into mine as we walked to the car. "They can tell their lies," she said softly, "but we'll tell the truth. And the truth is stronger." I squeezed her hand back, holding on to that small spark of hope. I knew we had the evidence. I knew we had the truth. But as I looked back at the building where my parents had just painted themselves as victims, I realized this was more than a fight for my name. It was a fight for everything I had built, everything they had tried to take away. And I wasn't going to let them win. The flight back to Tokyo felt different. I wasn't the scared little boy they had abandoned. I was a man with a voice. And I was done letting them take that away from me. Hiro and Chihiro worked quickly. Within 24 hours of the press conference in Marseille, they had organized our response in Tokyo. The press conference would be held at a small hotel ballroom near Shibuya, chosen for its calm atmosphere and its distance from the constant noise of downtown. Elise and I sat side by side at the long table, microphones lined up in front of us. She was calm, her back straight, and her hands folded neatly. Her hair had gone more silver than I remembered, but her eyes were still the same, steady, kind, and fierce. The room was packed, just like in France. Journalists from all over Japan, some from Europe and the US, crowded in, their cameras flashing as they set up. Sakura stood to the side, her sketchbook clutched against her chest, giving me a small, brave smile whenever I looked over. When Chihiro stepped up to the podium, she didn't waste any time. She started in Japanese, then switched to English and French, making sure no one in the room could claim they hadn't understood. "Julian Renault is not a victim of abduction," she said firmly, her voice slicing through the room like a knife. "We have here the notarized custody surrender documents, signed by Alan and Mireille Renault when Julian was 8 years old. We also have boarding school records, payment receipts for his care, and statements from social services confirming their decision to relinquish custody." She held up a thick folder, each page carefully organized and time-stamped. The cameras clicked wildly, journalists leaning forward to get a better view. Elise took a deep breath and leaned into the microphone. "I didn't steal a child," she said in French, her voice trembling slightly but gaining strength with every word. "I saved a soul. Julian was left at that boarding school with no goodbye, no explanation. His parents made a choice to walk away. I made a different choice, to stay, to love him as my own." The room went quiet. Even the journalists seemed to hold their breath. I could feel the truth settling into the space between us, heavy and undeniable. When it was my turn, I spoke slowly. My voice caught on a few words, but I didn't let it stop me. I looked up and met the eyes of every person in that room. "I am not a pawn," I said in English first, then repeated it in French. "I am not a child they can reclaim like some lost object. I am Julian Renault, and my story is not for sale." Chihiro took questions after that, answering calmly, efficiently. She had the documents scanned and projected onto a screen behind us, Alan and Mireille's signatures, the legal stamps, the final boarding school payment slip that had marked the end of their responsibility. Each piece of paper was like a nail in the coffin of their lies. I watched as the journalists' expressions shifted. Some scribbled notes furiously, some just sat back and nodded. A few of the French correspondents looked almost embarrassed, as if realizing how easily they'd been manipulated by my parents' show in Marseille. By the end, the questions had stopped being about whether I was telling the truth. They became about why my parents would do this now, after so many years. Chihiro gave no speculation, just facts. When it was finally over, Elise turned to me and placed her hand over mine. It's done, she said softly. You told your story, and now they can't twist it anymore. As we left the ballroom, Sakura wrapped her arms around me, burying her face against my shoulder. You were incredible, she whispered. You showed them who you are. I held her tight, feeling something I hadn't felt since that morning phone call from Hero Peace. Because no matter how loud the lies had been, the truth was louder now. We didn't go straight home. Elise wanted to stop at a small tea house near our apartment, a place she had taken me to when I first moved in with her. We sat there in the quiet, the clink of cups and the soft murmur of conversations around us like a shield. You know, she said, looking at me with a small smile, I always knew this day would come, the day you'd have to show the world the truth. I just didn't know how strong you'd be when it happened. I smiled back, feeling the weight of everything I'd carried fall away, bit by bit. I'm strong because you taught me to be. Outside, Tokyo pulsed with life, the city I'd chosen as my own. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could finally breathe again. The battle wasn't over. I knew that. But in that moment, I also knew we had already won something bigger, our right to our own story, told in our own words. And no one could ever take that away again. A few days after the press conference in Tokyo, Chihiro filed the lawsuit. Defamation, emotional abuse, civil abandonment. The charges were laid out in black and white, a cold echo of the truth I had lived for years. She didn't just want to shut down their lies. She wanted to make sure they could never try to spin them again. My biological parents didn't have the money to fight it. Alan's once profitable accounting firm had gone under years ago, and Mireille had never worked much outside the home. Their lawyer, the one they had so smugly hired in Paris, tried to bluff and threaten, but Chihiro just raised an eyebrow and handed him the stack of documents that showed how thoroughly they had abandoned me. A month later, a settlement was reached. They agreed to retract all their claims publicly and pay damages, an amount they couldn't afford. So they were forced to sell the little apartment in Marseille they'd clung to like a relic of a past that was already gone. I watched the news reports trickle in, the tone shifting from scandal to pity to cold disdain. The media had moved on to a new target, leaving Alan and Mireille's names behind as just another cautionary tale. Opportunists, the papers called them. Desperate, grasping. Words I'd once thought described me, but now I saw them for who they were. I didn't feel triumphant. It wasn't about revenge. I thought I would feel vindicated. But all I felt was relief, a deep, heavy relief that settled in my bones like a long exhale. Elise and I sat at the kitchen table the night the final settlement papers came through. She read them slowly, her lips pressed together in a thin line. When she was done, she set them down and looked at me. I'm proud of you, she said. Her voice was soft, but there was a strength in it that had always been there, even when I was too young to see it. I didn't want it to come to this, I admitted. I didn't want to destroy them. You didn't, she said, shaking her head. They destroyed themselves. You just stopped letting them write your story. It was true. And yet, I couldn't help but think about what they had lost. Not the money, or the apartment, or the public respect. That had never been real. But the family they could have had if they'd only known how to love me. I thought about that little boy in Normandy, hoping for a miracle that would never come. And I realized I didn't feel sorry for them anymore. I just felt done. Extended relatives began to cut them off one by one. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years reached out to me privately, offering apologies, awkward and fumbling. Some of them admitted they'd believed the lies for a while, caught up in the drama and the easy headlines. Others said they'd always known the truth but hadn't known how to say it. I told them I didn't hold it against them. I didn't have room in my life for grudges anymore. Even my fans, the ones who had watched me climb through the esports ranks, rallied around me. Messages poured in on social media, support, love, stories of kids who had been left behind like me and found their own ways to speak. It felt like a circle closing, like something bigger than just my story. The final blow came when I heard Alan and Mireille had been evicted from their home. I saw a photo in a local paper, Alan standing outside with a box of his old accounting trophies, Mireille clutching a worn-out suitcase. They looked small, fragile, like the weight of their own lies had finally crushed them. I didn't feel sorry, not for them, but for the emptiness they had chosen instead of me. The day the restraining order was granted, making sure they couldn't contact me ever again, I sat in the quiet of my apartment in Tokyo and let myself cry, not out of sadness, but out of the sheer release of it all. Sakura was there, her arms wrapped around me. Elise sat across the room, her eyes shining with the kind of pride that never needed to be spoken out loud. It's over, Sakura whispered. You're free. I nodded, the word tasting new and strange on my tongue. Free. I had spent so long fighting for a place in their world, but I didn't need it anymore. My world was here, with Elise and Sakura, with the fans who saw me, with the people who loved me not in spite of my voice, but because of it. I wiped my face and looked around the small, warm apartment I called home. For the first time in my life, I realized I wasn't defined by what I'd lost. I was defined by what I'd chosen, and I chose to live. The months after the lawsuit felt like coming up for air after being underwater for years. For the first time, the quiet in my life didn't feel empty, it felt like peace. Elise, Sakura, and I moved to a small house outside Kyoto. It was a modest place, with creaky floorboards and a tiny garden that Elise had fallen in love with the first time she saw it. She'd always wanted a garden of her own, somewhere she could sit with a cup of tea and watch the seasons change. Now she had it, and she spent hours there every day, her hands buried in the soil, her face soft and content. I kept gaming, of course. It wasn't just a job for me anymore. It was a way of telling the world that I was still here, that I was still standing. My new brand focused on supporting kids with speech disorders, funding programs and scholarships so no one would have to feel the way I did when I was a child. The logo was simple, a stylized fox, Renard, because that was me, and I wanted every kid who saw it to know that their voice was a strength, not a flaw. The fans didn't forget me. They showed up in droves for my streams and tournaments, flooding the chat with messages of hope and love. I couldn't answer them all, but I read every word, feeling the weight of it in my chest like a promise I would never break. Sakura and I grew even closer in those months. She'd bring her sketchbook out to the garden while I played, sometimes sketching the trees or the fox logo she'd helped design. Other times she'd draw me, her eyes moving from the screen to my face with a soft smile. I loved those moments more than anything, the simple, quiet kind of love that didn't need to be spoken to be understood. One crisp spring afternoon, I took her out to the garden. The cherry blossoms were in full bloom, pale pink petals drifting down like confetti. Elise was tending her vegetables, humming to herself. I took a deep breath, feeling my heart race in my chest. "Sakura," I said, my voice catching just a little. I know I'm not always the easiest person to understand, but you've always made me feel like I didn't need to be perfect to be loved." She looked at me, her eyes wide and bright. "Julian." I pulled out the small ring box I'd been carrying for weeks. My hands were shaking, but I didn't care. I'd waited my whole life to be sure of something, and I was sure of this. "Will you marry me?" I asked, my voice low and steady. Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded before I'd even finished. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking with laughter. "Yes, of course." Elise looked up from her garden, her smile warm and knowing. "About time," she said, and we all laughed together, the sound soft and bright in the spring air. The wedding wasn't fancy, just a small gathering in the garden Elise had poured her heart into, surrounded by the people who mattered most. Sakura wore a simple dress, and I wore a suit that still felt strange on my shoulders but perfect in that moment. Elise cried through the whole ceremony, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief she'd kept from her own wedding, decades ago. Afterward, we sat under the cherry trees, sharing stories and laughter, the petals drifting down around us like a blessing. I looked at Sakura, at Elise, at the life we'd built together, and I realized I didn't need anything more than this. I ended my story not with anger or bitterness, but with hope. In one of my final interviews before taking a break from the competitive scene, I told the journalist the same thing I'd always needed to hear when I was younger. "I want every kid who's ever felt like their voice doesn't matter to know this," I said. "You are not broken. You are not too much or too little. You are enough, exactly as you are." The headlines moved on, the world kept spinning, but in our little house outside Kyoto, life slowed down. Elise tended her garden, Sakura filled the house with her art, and I kept playing my games, my voice steady and strong. This was my life, built from everything I'd survived, filled with love and laughter, quiet mornings and bright afternoons. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was fighting for a place in it. I just belonged.